Could you talk about the status of coverage of global warming and the issue of balanced reporting?
Yeah, I think balanced reporting on climate change is bogus. I think it is it's journalistic malpractice to approach a story about climate change striving for balance. Because it's not, when it comes to the science, it's not a balance. There is no balance when you have 98+% of the scientists in the field saying this is real, this is now, this is going to affect us in profound ways that it's going to challenge the core of our civilization. And you have 2% saying it's not. And then you have a very loud chorus of people with all kinds of interests saying that it's bogus. And that's not, to take a balanced approach and say, well, these people say this, and these people say this, so we don't really know. But the truth is somewhere in the middle is terrible journalism. And there's been a huge amount of terrible journalism committed on climate change over the years, which is not to say that it's not, that the science doesn't have huge gaps and there isn't still a tremendous amount of uncertainty about how the global climate system works in some particular ways and how particular places will be affected at particular points in the future, and whether you can trace a particular weather event to the overall change in the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide and methane and the like. So there is still a great deal of uncertainty, and I think that it is important and vital as journalists to engage with that uncertainty and how scientists are trying to fill those gaps, and how communities are or are not responding to the challenges of dealing with that uncertainty. How do we live? How do we plan? How do we do things based on incomplete knowledge, but with a general understanding that things are changing and in ways that are going to be very disruptive. And it's not necessarily a matter of whether it's going to be good or bad, it's just going to be disruptive. And that's one of the biggest problems that we're going to have to face. I'm sorry, I sort of wandered off a little bit, but you do have to convey the uncertainty, but I think you also have a responsibility to convey the certainty and what is known and what is well-established scientific, as close to scientific fact as you can get.
Do you think we're hearing enough about it in daily news coverage, or do you think the environmental beat is getting better in certain part of the countries versus another for some reason?
I don't think we're hearing enough about it. I hope that's not because this is what I do and I care especially about it, and I think everybody needs to be paying more attention to it. I do think that these are really issues that we are already having to confront, the impacts that climate change is having in our lives and in our communities, and it's not being sufficiently covered. It's being covered better in some places than in other places. It's being covered better in some media than in other media, but in some places it's being covered, worse than it was even a few years ago. I think we went through a period where there was, a lot of really bad coverage, even as there was a lot of very good coverage, but I think in most of the mainstream media there was a lot of really bad coverage leading up to about 2005, 2006, that roughly coincided with Al Gore and The Inconvenient Truth and Katrina, which happened to coincide in a totally unpredictable way. That brought a surge of coverage, and in some ways I think finally a moment among journalists and the general public of acceptance that we don't have to have this debate anymore. But I think we kind of backslid since then. I think part of that is because of concerted effort by some very specific interests to undermine public confidence in the science. The whole thing about the stolen emails of surrounding Michael Mann and all these people that are supposedly trying to mess with the science to prove that something happened that's not really happening. It was no coincidence that happened right before Copenhagen, and it had a tremendously powerful impact on the public debate in the United States over climate change. And I think that it caused even a lot of journalists to just kind of either throw up their hands or just suddenly get caught up again in that, like he said, she said, treating it as sort of a political issue again rather than a real scientific issue. And also, frankly, we do have tremendously pressing, immediate concerns, and that's going to push stuff like this, not just off the front pages, but out of the papers, out of the news. And at the same time, journalism is going through a tremendous, I don't want to say completely retrenchment, but a seismic shift in how journalism is done, who's doing it, how people get their journalism. And so journalists, environment journalists in particular, are being laid off or being reassigned. And some of them are finding homes elsewhere and doing new stuff in really exciting ways online and elsewhere, but many of them are not. They're leaving the business. So I think that there is a real sort of crisis in this particular part of journalism that's part of a much larger crisis in journalism.